The most consequential economic move of this decade did not happen in a war zone. It did not happen in front of cameras. It happened in a building with no public address between people whose names were never released, over 72 hours that most of the world spent watching something else entirely. And the country most affected by what happened in that building was not in the room. Think about that for a moment. The industrial future of an entire nation, its battery supply chains, its mining sector, its export markets, was redesigned by two foreign governments while its own prime minister was reading briefings about what had already been decided. The media will tell you this is a trade dispute, a tariff story, a bit of political posturing between neighbors who will sort it out eventually. But here is what the media is not telling you. This was not a tariff. Tariffs create friction. What happened in May 2026 was something qualitatively different. It was a structural redesign of an entire continent's economic geography executed through simultaneous legislation and commodity contracts in a single 72-hour window. That is not trade policy. That is economic surgery performed on a patient who was not informed they were on the table. The mechanism that made this possible and the response that may have neutralized it is what this video is about. Here is the number that anchors everything: $800 billion. That is the annual value of trade flowing between the United States and Canada, not over a decade, every single year, woven across a century of shared infrastructure, shared supply chains, shared borders, so integrated that 3.2 million American workers owe their jobs directly to the Canadian side of that relationship. And 41% of all American crude oil imports come from one source, Canada. There is no alternative supply within a 5-year horizon, not one. That number, 800 billion, is not reported as context for this story. It is reported, if at all, as a footnote. And the reason it is treated as a footnote is that acknowledging its full weight destroys the dominant narrative, which is that Canada is a minor trading partner that can be repositioned without consequence. That narrative is the miscalculation, and the miscalculation, as you will see, is becoming expensive. 3 weeks before any of this became public, a delegation left Washington without press coverage, without an official itinerary, and without the standard diplomatic paperwork that would leave a paper trail. They traveled commercially, they checked into separate hotels, they met in an unregistered location, and over the following 72 hours, they drafted the architecture of what has since emerged as one of the most consequential backroom arrangements in modern North American history. Canada was not invited. Canada was the subject. On the second day of the official state visit to Beijing, the White House published a 47-page policy document. The language was legal, precise, and unmistakable in its intent. Any company wishing to access the new generation of federal tax incentives, and these incentives were historic in scale, was required to locate all strategic production inside the United States, not North America, not the continent. The United States. Battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, artificial intelligence infrastructure, defense supply chain inputs, all of it inside the United States. And then there was one provision, a single paragraph, written with one country in mind. Any company relocating strategic production capacity from a USMCA partner nation to the United States within 18 months would receive an additional 15% tax credit on top of all existing incentives. They were not simply pulling investment out of Canada, they were subsidizing the extraction. That same afternoon, Beijing signed the largest single-year agricultural purchase agreement in the history of U.S.-China trade. Soybeans, beef, pork, wheat, and feed grains. $94 billion in agricultural trade redirected overnight. Markets that Canadian farmers had supplied for decades, gone in a single afternoon, in a deal signed on the other side of the planet. Canada was not consulted. Canada was not notified. Canada was the mechanism through which two great powers had chosen to serve their mutual interests simultaneously. Washington wanted manufacturing jobs back before the next election cycle. Beijing wanted trade stability to slow its own economic deceleration. The most efficient path to both ran directly through Ottawa. Not past it, through it. A senior White House advisor, quoted anonymously in the days that followed, said, "Why share industrial prosperity with Canada when America can keep all of it?" That sentence was not a slip. It was a description of the policy. Read section 14, paragraph 3 in its full context, and you will understand that it was written by someone thinking specifically about Ontario. Ontario had spent over $30 billion building EV manufacturing capacity, battery plants, component lines, research corridors connecting university engineering departments to factory floors. The province had methodically and patiently positioned itself to become the electric vehicle capital of North America. That positioning was on track until the morning the Beijing agreements went public. Within 48 hours, 3 major Chinese battery manufacturers with signed letters of intent for Ontario facilities made simultaneous announcements. One relocated to Texas. One announced a new site outside Phoenix. One suspended all Canadian commitments indefinitely. Washington then announced that Chinese companies choosing to manufacture in the United States rather than Canada would receive streamlined regulatory approval, compressing processes that normally take years into 90 days. They were not just offering a reward, they were removing every friction point that previously made relocation complicated. Subscribe to the channel right now if you want to follow every development in this story as it unfolds. These analyses go out daily on conflicts that change by the hour. Now let's talk about what Canada actually sits on, because the critical minerals dimension of this confrontation is what transforms it from a bilateral trade dispute into a structural realignment whose consequences reach every major economy on the planet. Canada holds some of the largest deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth elements in the world. These are not optional inputs. There is no electric vehicle without lithium. There is no advanced semiconductor without cobalt. There is no modern weapon system without the rare earth elements whose global supply is currently dominated by 2 countries, China and the Western alternative, which is Canada and Australia. For decades, this resource base was Canada's quiet strategic insurance. No major power could simply sideline a country sitting on that scale of critical material wealth. The Beijing agreements were specifically designed to neutralize that insurance. Washington committed to fast-tracking domestic critical mineral extraction at a scale not seen since the Second World War, overriding review timelines, invoking the Defense Production Act, accelerating permits that had been stalled for years. Beijing simultaneously agreed to redirect Chinese investment capital away from Canadian mining projects and toward American equivalents. Canadian mining stocks fell an average of 14% in the single week following the summit. 2 major lithium projects in British Columbia, both carrying secured Chinese financing, saw that financing suspended within 10 days. A confidential internal assessment, later obtained by investigative journalists and circulated to Canadian cabinet members, contained one sentence that captured the entire strategic shift. Canada is at risk of becoming a raw material supplier while all value-added production migrates south of the border, not a partner in the supply chain, but a quarry. Now let's talk about Mark Carney, because understanding who this man is and what he has actually done at the highest levels of global finance is understanding why the characterization of him as weak is the specific kind of misreading that his press conference warned would be expensive. Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada. He guided that country through the 2008 financial crisis with more institutional precision and less collateral damage than any comparable advanced economy achieved in the same period. He was then appointed governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen in that institution's 300-year history to hold the role. Before that, 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs, navigating the most complex private sector financial negotiations the global economy produces. His doctorate in economics is from Oxford. This is not a politician who learned economics as a rhetorical tool. This is an economist who spent 3 decades at the absolute apex of the global financial system, managing crises where trillions of dollars were at stake, negotiating with governments, institutions that held the leverage in those conversations, and learning in those rooms that the most dangerous people are never the ones who announce what they are about to do. They are the ones who have already done it before anyone else has noticed. The night the Beijing agreements became fully public, Carney did not call a press conference. He did not post on social media. He did not call Washington. He sat at his desk and read every page of the North American Manufacturing Priority Act. Section 14, paragraph 3. Every line of the agricultural contract framework, the critical minerals provisions, 4 hours of reading, then 3 phone calls, not to Washington, not to London, to Tokyo, to Berlin, and to a third capital that has not been publicly named. 48 hours after Air Force One touchdown at Joint Base Andrews, Mark Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa. Maple leaf flags behind him, 2 cameras, no teleprompter, no notes visible. He stood still for a moment, the room went quiet, and then he spoke. Canada is not a bargaining chip. Canada is not a concession in someone else's framework. Canada is not a line item negotiated in rooms where it was not invited to sit. Canada is not a country whose industrial future gets decided by bilateral arrangements designed in its absence. 3 days ago, the President of the United States sat in Beijing and agreed with the government that Canada has been managing diplomatically with careful consistency since the Cold War, a set of arrangements designed explicitly to reduce Canada's manufacturing capacity, redirect Canada's export markets, and undermine Canada's investment environment. He did not consult us. He did not notify us. He did not extend the basic diplomatic courtesy that one nation extends to another after more than a century of shared alliance. And this morning he posted on social media that Canada should fix its economy. He looked up, he looked directly into the camera. Canada's economy does not need fixing by those who would dismantle it. It needs to be defended from those who treat partnership as value to be extracted, and an alliance as a convenience to be discarded the moment a more profitable arrangement appears across the Pacific. He closed the folder. To those who believe that Canada will absorb this quietly, that patience is the same as weakness, that restraint is the same as submission, 3 seconds of complete silence. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. That press conference was viewed 47 million times in the first 24 hours. Not because it was dramatic. Political speeches go viral for drama. This was not dramatic. It was cold, precise, controlled. The stillness of a man who is telling you exactly what he has prepared, and who has prepared everything. 47 million views because the people watching, including the people in Washington who did not want to be watching, understood that they were not watching a performance. They were watching a report. This is what I know. This is what I have planned. This is what is going to happen. Trump's response came the following morning. All talk, no action, very weak. 6 words from the man who had just restructured the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in human history in 72 hours without consulting the country being restructured. The characterization of weakness arrived before the 6 counter-moves had fully become visible. By the time they did, the characterization required revision. What Carney executed in the 72 hours following the Beijing agreements is the strategic response that will be studied in diplomatic programs for a generation. None of the moves were announced as a package. None were framed as retaliation. Each was presented with deliberate precision as a routine exercise of Canadian sovereign economic policy. Together, they constituted the most coordinated economic counterpositioning by a mid-sized power against a superpower in the modern era. Move 1. Canada formally notified the United States Trade Representative that it was initiating a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, specifically flagging the Section 14 relocation incentives as potential violations of the agreement's investment neutrality provisions. Not a threat, a legal process, quiet, procedurally correct, and impossible to dismiss because it invokes a binding international agreement that the United States itself negotiated, signed, and has repeatedly cited as the governing framework for North American trade. The compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. It will run. It will generate findings, and those findings carry legal weight that no press conference denial can override. Move 2. Canada announced an emergency expansion of its Critical Minerals Investment Authority, a new sovereign fund capitalized at $40 billion, specifically structured to replace the Chinese investment capital that had been redirected away from Canadian mining projects. Sovereign funds of this capitalization do not appear fully structured 48 hours after the triggering event unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, Townsend, the investment mandate, were already prepared before the triggering event occurred. Carney had been building this since his Tokyo phone call. Move 3. Canada announced a new bilateral industrial partnership with the European Union, a fast-tracked manufacturing investment corridor that EU trade officials had been drafting for 3 months, waiting for exactly this political moment. The Brussels announcement arrived with complete documentation, investment timeline, and legal framework precisely because it had been prepared in anticipation of a moment when Canadian industrial assets would become available at a discount, and the European Union would have both the commercial justification and the strategic rationale to acquire positions at scale. Move 4. Canada announced preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia for critical mineral supply, positioning itself as the primary alternative to Chinese mineral supply for allied nations, increasingly focused on supply chain resilience. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are 3 of the 4 industrial economies that most urgently need a trusted alternative supplier for the critical minerals that China currently dominates globally. Canada had just become the preferred alternative supplier for all 3 simultaneously. Move 5. Carney's office released a full economic impact assessment of what American supply chains actually depend on from Canada. Not a political document, an economic document prepared by Statistics Canada and 3 independent research institutions. The numbers were specific and designed to be specific. $800 billion in bilateral trade annually, 3.2 million American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains. 41% of total American crude oil imports from Canada, with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon. These numbers were not produced for the press conference. They were produced for boardrooms, for the employers of 3.2 million American workers, for energy market analysts tracking the crude import dependency, for bond market participants, for central bank governors, for allied capitals. The document was arithmetic presented to the audience that reads arithmetic most carefully. Move 6 was the most operationally consequential of all, and the one that produced the most immediate measurable results. Carney personally called the CEOs of 11 major American corporations with significant operations in both countries, not to threaten them, to inform them. He told each one, calmly and with complete specificity, exactly what Section 14 relocation incentives would cost them in Canadian regulatory cooperation, Canadian resource access, and Canadian market participation if they chose to pursue them. He was not issuing ultimatums. He was doing the math with them out loud in real time, allowing each CEO to perform for themselves the calculation that their own financial advisors would eventually present to them anyway. When the calls were done, 7 of the 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing any relocation review pending further regulatory clarity. 3 others did not move immediately but have since initiated internal reviews. One company proceeded and has since discovered that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval that Washington advertised has in practice involved timelines closer to 4 years. Now let's talk about what has happened in the weeks since, because the immediate reactions have been followed by secondary and tertiary effects that tell you which side of this confrontation had correctly modeled the response dynamics. The 3 Chinese battery manufacturers that pivoted away from Ontario within 48 hours of the Beijing agreements, 2 of them have quietly reinitiated contact with their original Canadian partners. The reason is not diplomatic pressure. The reason is not political sentiment. The reason is that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval turned out to require the 4-year process that the actual regulatory framework mandates, regardless of political preference. The manufacturers did the math. Canada was still faster. The infrastructure was already there. The workforce was already trained. The supply chain connections were already built. The $30 billion Ontario had invested had produced a platform that could not be replicated in a new American location without the time and investment cost that erased whatever the 15% credit was supposed to provide. The tax incentive was large enough to generate announcements. It was not large enough to make the full economics of relocation work for manufacturers who had already built their Canadian operations to operational readiness. The agricultural contracts tell their own secondary story. Canadian canola exports to China fell sharply in the immediate period following the agreements. Canadian grain farmers experienced the specific kind of acute economic pain that the futures price collapse had telegraphed. A grain farmer outside Regina who had sold canola to China for 22 years sat in his truck in his own field for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to call his bank. He did not say he was angry. He said, "We are being replaced." Two words that captured everything about the human dimension of a geopolitical transaction executed in rooms where neither he nor anyone representing his interests was present. But within 30 days, Canada had accelerated negotiations with India and Indonesia to absorb the displaced volume at comparable price points. The market diversification that displacement forced Canada to execute has produced a more resilient agricultural export architecture than the single dominant buyer model that preceded the Beijing agreements. The pain was real. The structural result may be more durable than the arrangement it replaced. The critical minerals investment gap has produced results that were not visible in the immediate aftermath, but are now defining the medium-term picture. 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed a combined $22 billion to Canadian mining projects in the weeks following the Beijing agreements, capital that had been standing by, watching the Canadian mining sector, waiting for the moment when assets became available at a discount. Trump had created a sale. The buyers who arrived at that sale were not American. They were European. And the strategic consequence of European sovereign capital owning significant positions in Canadian critical mineral production is a different geopolitical outcome from the one the Beijing agreements were designed to produce. The agreements were designed to leave Canada without the investment capital to develop its critical mineral assets, allowing Washington to position American domestic extraction as the alternative supply base for allied demand. Instead, allied capital has flowed to Canadian assets, making Canada the critical mineral supplier of record for European, Japanese, Korean, and Australian industrial demand, while simultaneously giving those allied economies a direct financial stake in Canadian resource development that creates its own structural support for Canadian supply chain integration with the broader allied economic architecture. A Wall Street analyst published a note that circulated to every major financial desk on 3 continents. It read, "The administration appears to have confused Canada's patience with Canada's weakness. The distinction is becoming expensive. That is not partisan commentary. It is the financial sector's reading of the transaction data, the corporate announcement patterns, the investment flow records, and the compliance review timeline that together constitute the measurable outcomes of the confrontation so far." Let's talk about the 4-second pause, because this is the moment from the entire sequence that captures in its smallest form what the larger strategic picture contains. 1 week after Air Force One returned from Beijing, a journalist at a White House press briefing asked the press secretary whether the administration had calculated what a successful Canadian USMCA compliance claim would cost American businesses in the affected sectors. The press secretary said, "We are not concerned about that." The journalist followed up by asking whether the administration had reviewed the Canadian Economic Impact Assessment document showing 3.2 million American jobs tied to Canadian supply chains. The press secretary said, "We will take a look at that." And then the journalist asked the question the entire room had been building toward when the president said Canada's good run is over. Is that the official position of this administration on the alliance? The press secretary paused. 4 seconds, caught in every camera in the room. 4 seconds of silence from a spokesperson whose entire professional function is to answer questions without hesitation. Then she said, "Next question." That 4-second pause was broadcast on every major Canadian network that evening, played directly beside footage of Carney's press conference. The contrast required no commentary. One man had looked into a camera with no notes, no teleprompter, and said exactly what he believed clearly, precisely, without hesitation, with the stillness of someone who had prepared every word and knew the words were accurate. The other side had needed 4 seconds to decide what it was permitted to say, and then chose to say nothing at all. Here is where things stand, and here is the complete picture. The North American Manufacturing Priority Act is law. Section 14, paragraph 3 is in effect. The agricultural contracts are signed. The investment has begun moving. And simultaneously, 7 of the 11 American CEOs Carney called are pausing relocation reviews. Two of the three Chinese battery manufacturers are back in conversation with their Canadian partners. Three European sovereign wealth funds have committed $22 billion to Canadian mining. Canada has signed preferential mineral supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The EU fast-tracked industrial corridor is being built. The USMCA compliance review is running with no scheduled end date. The economic impact assessment with 3.2 million American jobs sits on record at every financial analysis desk covering North American trade. And the 4-second pause is playing on a loop in Ottawa. Trump arrived in Beijing bold, loud, and certain. He left believing he had won everything. He restructured the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in human history in 72 hours without consulting the country being restructured. He told the world that Canada's good run was over. He posted on social media that the Canadian Prime Minister was weak. That certainty is the miscalculation, because the man who walked to a podium in Ottawa with no teleprompter and closed his folder before the most important sentence was not performing certainty. He was reporting on preparation that had been underway for months. While Trump was calibrating his statement in the Great Hall of the People, Carney had already called Tokyo and Berlin. While Air Force One was in the air returning from Beijing, Carney was on the phone with 11 American CEOs doing math with them out loud. While Trump was posting about weakness, Carney's sovereign fund was being capitalized, his EU corridor was being finalized, his preferential mineral agreements were being signed, and his compliance review was being filed. Trump was bold in Beijing. Carney was ready in Ottawa. And here is the number I have kept for the end: 3.2 million. The number of American workers whose jobs depend directly on the Canadian supply chains that Section 14, Paragraph 3 was designed to dismantle. That number is not a Canadian talking point. It is a figure produced by Statistics Canada and 3 independent research institutions and placed on the desk of every financial analyst, every CEO, every bond market participant, and every allied government that has been watching this confrontation. It is the number that nobody at the White House podium wanted to address when the journalist asked. It is the number that made 7 American CEOs pause their relocation reviews. It is the number that the 4-second silence was about. The question that 12 months of outcomes will answer, the question that every boardroom, every financial desk, every allied government, and every sovereignty-conscious middle power is now watching is whether the man who announced the end of Canada's good run had modeled what happens when the country whose good run he declared over turns out to have been preparing for exactly that announcement for the better part of a year. The 21st century is not won by the power that moves first. It is won by the power that has already moved before anyone noticed. The misreading, as Carney said without raising his voice, will be expensive. The only thing still being determined is how expensive and for whom.